Welcome back, listeners. This is episode 8 of the Foods Across the U.S. podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Layla.
And I'm Emma. For those new listeners who may not know, Layla and I both share a common interest in biological processes and chemical processes and how they relate to food and human health.
Today we're going down south to the Peach State, Georgia.
Yeah, and I don't know if any of you listeners know, but Layla and I are both from Georgia.
Yeah, so we definitely know and love Southern cooking. My mom makes the best sweet potato casserole.
Yep, but there's nothing better than a pulled pork sandwich or some coleslaw and a glass of sweet tea. Or some peach cobbler.
Yeah, the South is known for a lot of really great food, but that's not all they have in common. You may have noticed, but Southern food isn't the healthiest.
Here to tell us a little bit more about that is historian Susanna Lee.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. If you don't know me, I'm Susanna Lee, and I am a historian at the Savannah Museum of History.
So, Susanna, before we dive in, what's your favorite Southern food?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think I'd have to say biscuits and gravy. I just have really fond memories of that growing up.
It's a great choice.
So, Susanna, what do you have to tell us about Southern cooking and the history behind it?
Yeah, so it all really comes back to when sugar was introduced into the Americas around the 1600s. Sugar was a great cash crop, so plantations in the South loved to grow sugar, made lots of money, and made them very successful. So sugar was very prominent in the South at that time. Sugar was used in a lot of recipes, and that kind of devolved into what it is today, where you have a lot of desserts being named Southern foods.
That's really interesting. Do you think that culture behind Southern cooking and how we use a lot of sugar in our food, in our cooking, has caused a lot of people in the South to be unhealthier compared to other regions of the world?
Yeah, so like I was talking about, plantation owners obviously didn't have to do a lot of work and so all they really did was eat with all those sugary foods. It really leads to an unhealthy diet, and over time, it just gets worse and worse. So I definitely think that sugar's history in the South definitely has something to do with health problems. Yeah, and so actually what you see happening is there's a trend of diabetes being more prominent in the southern United States as compared to the rest of the US and even the rest of the world.
Actually, that's very interesting that you brought that up. We've been noticing a tie between Southern cooking and diabetes within the South.
Right. And for those of you who don't know, diabetes is basically when your body can't process the amount of glucose that's in your bloodstream from eating super sugary meals. And this is different from type 1, as type 1 is a genetic disorder where your body can't produce insulin to process the glucose in your bloodstream. You see type 2 diabetes being really prominent in the South. And like Layla has said, there's a chance that this is tied to the amount of sugar that's in Southern cooking.
To provide some context for the background of the higher percentages of diabetes in the South, the average for men is around 13% within the United States and 11% within women. But when you go to places such as Mississippi, West Virginia, Louisiana, and even Georgia, the rates increase to around 16.6% for men and 14.8%. This is not only a regional issue, but it can also be seen on a racial basis, where 16.7% of Latino men and 17.2% of Latino women develop diabetes. This can be tied to the high rates of obesity in the South and also the concentration of rich foods with processed sugars, saturated fats, and lots of butter.
Okay, so you think that like culture and location has something to do with the amount of diabetes that is prominent in the area?
I think the facts are telling us that, but there's been no conclusive studies that have been able to draw a direct correlation because diabetes is not just about your intake of sugar, but also about how your body interacts with glucose.
Okay, so to further delve in on how type 2 diabetes happens in your body or really like the biological background behind this, I'm going to talk about the bodily processes that contribute to type 2 diabetes. So when you eat a meal, you have a sugar content in that meal, which with Southern cooking, as we've established, usually has a really high sugar content. And this is processed in your body as glucose. Your pancreas pumps out insulin to lower blood glucose levels after you've eaten a meal, especially with one that has sugar content. However, with like type 2 diabetes, your pancreas cannot keep up with the magnitude of glucose levels in the blood, and the insulin receptors on human cells begin to fail to respond to the pancreas's production of insulin. So without functioning insulin receptors, these glucose channels do not open and allow glucose to enter the cell, which leads to fatigue, overeating, and just ultimately a lot of the time obesity, which we see has a higher magnitude in the southern United States.
Well, you've mentioned obesity and increased sugar intake as factors that can cause type 2 diabetes. What are some other factors that could lead to type 2 diabetes?
So type 2 diabetes is not always caused by a high sugar diet. It can also be, as I've said, sometimes obesity predisposes an individual to type 2 diabetes. Also other factors such as abdominal fat, genetic issues, chronic illness, excess carbs, and lack of exercise or quality sleep.
What are some Southern cooking foods that you could see that would directly connect to this increase of carb and sugar content that maybe people should stray away?
So, I mean, with any sort of Southern baking, of course, you're going to see a lot of sugar in these recipes, but also anything that's a very carby thing, such as cornbread or anything like rolls, even just have a high sugar content because obviously carbohydrates are sugars. And when you're eating a lot of these foods, especially in cultures where you eat Southern cooked foods very consistently, your pancreas is constantly being used a lot, and this can lead to type 2 diabetes by overuse of pancreas to try to stabilize the glucose levels in your blood.
What are some changes that you would recommend for Southerners if they're trying to stray away from becoming at risk for type 2 diabetes, but don't totally want to cut out all Southern foods from their diet?
So contrary to type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes is not always permanent because it's not that your pancreas cannot produce insulin, it's just that the insulin it's produced is not processed by the body. And so a lot of time with a change from you can just begin to have a healthier diet with a little less sugar or carbs and include some healthy fats, proteins, and also just increase in exercise. One can possibly reach a life with fully functioning insulin receptors on their cells that can help regulate their glucose levels in their bloodstream. So Layla, I know you know a little more about this than I do. So what kind of chemical breakdown is in really high sugar Southern foods that can contribute to conditions such as type 2 diabetes?
So, in a lot of high sugar foods, specifically ones that you find in grocery stores or even in restaurants, they contain something called high fructose corn syrup, which is often villainized and talked about in the media for good reason. So, 55% of high fructose corn syrup is made up of fructose, which is a type of sugar, but unlike glucose, which you talked about previously, it's not as easily broken down by the body. It promotes a sort of visceral fat which accumulates around your organs and is one of the most dangerous types of fat and is one of the leading reasons people tend to be obese. This fat builds up around the body and stops the organs from being able to work as well. But fructose is also a leading cause of insulin resistance. Most Americans on average consume 3 to 4 times the amount of fructose they're supposed to consume a day, but in the South that goes to around 6 or 7% because of how many processed carbs people in the South consume. But this is not the singular factor people gain type 2 diabetes, as you previously brought up. But if people avoid processed sugars such as high fructose corn syrup, or even just switch from buying their Southern dishes at a grocery store to making them at home, where they can control the amount of sugar, or even switch it out for something more natural like agave syrup or honey, this can dramatically change. The reason why fructose is so hard to break down is because it doesn't travel throughout the body in the same way glucose does. Glucose interacts with all the cells in the body and is slowly broken down chemical by chemical and is used in things when we're doing heavy exercise like running and is one of the main reasons athletes tend to carb load before they go on long runs or participate in any high intensity athletic sport. Fructose kind of goes straight to your liver, and your liver has to work overtime to kind of break it down and flush it out because our bodies aren't truly meant to produce, consume fructose, especially in the amounts that we tend to consume it as Americans, specifically supplements.
Okay, so you would say that usually if Southerners do not want to change, their eating habits, they should try to move away from store-bought foods instead of and just cook at home because you can avoid that high fructose corn syrup a little more.
Yes, I would say that would be a really small change you could make. Obviously, cooking and baking is not for everyone, but there are hundreds of thousands of recipes and people out there who are very slightly tweaking Southern recipes to make them more healthier. So using whole milk or honey instead of more processed stuff. But this is not always a reality that people do because these healthier ingredients tend to be more expensive, and buying things from fast food restaurants or even just pre-made from the grocery store can be cheaper than the app.
Right. So now we're gonna talk to Susanna about how we often see, as you said, with lower income communities or in rural areas, this isn't always a reality where you can always cook with natural ingredients from home. So how these diabetes rates might be even higher in these areas.
Yeah, so the South has a lot of rural communities, and that goes back to the plantations that it was built on, because plantations obviously had to be very spread out. And so those communities didn't really develop the same way that it did in New England, where there's big packed cities. So what you see is the South is a lot more rural. And when it's rural, you have less access to materials, and it's harder to get more expensive goods because you don't have a Kroger next to your house.
So how would you say things such as food deserts, food insecurity, and even poverty can play a role in the way people eat and consume food within the South?
Yeah, so when you're in a food desert, you don't have the luxury of watching what you eat because you have to eat whatever you have available.
When reading an article released by the CDC about the high rates of obesity and where they did a study of the in rural communities versus metropolitan communities, about 34.2% of adults within rural communities, specifically in the South, had were considered obese or morbidly obese, whereas in metropolitan counties, 28.7%. And this increased when we went down south.
Yeah, so in cities, it's a lot more walkable, so it's a lot easier to get exercise. In rural communities, you really don't leave your house. The plantation is maybe like 20 acres, and you're not going to go much farther than that in a rural community. So it's a lot harder to get exercise when you're out in the middle of nowhere. While in cities, you see that it's a lot more walkable, and so people usually will stay a lot more in shape that way.
Thank you, Susanna, for coming in and just lending a little historical background on Southern cooking and why it's so high in sugar. And now, after a word from our sponsors, we are going to have Dr. Anthony Pepitone from Stony Brook University come and help us further delve into this idea of Southern cooking.
Hey y'all, my name's Linda, and I'm the pioneer woman on the Food Network channel. I'm so excited to be sponsoring this episode of Food Across America. Join me Sundays at 5 while I bake a pecan pie on the Food Network channel. See ya!
Thank you guys so much for having me.
So, first things first, what's your favorite Southern food?
Well, being from New York, I'm not too sure that much about Southern food, so why don't you guys give me your favorite foods?
Me personally, I think I'm a big biscuits and gravy girl.
I love specifically on Thanksgiving, but even all year long, I love corn casserole. Have you ever tried that?
I've had neither of those things, but I bet y'all haven't had some good New York pizza.
I haven't.
Yeah, I don't think I can say I have.
Yeah, New York just does it different, I guess. Yeah, so as you guys have mentioned, the South is a bit more rural than some of the cities. Like, where I'm from, New York, we have a hospital within a 5-minute drive, no matter what. But when it comes to that, it's hard to find medication and the funds to get these devices and like medication for treating this diabetes. So a couple things here is type 1 diabetes is costing about 4,500 to 6,500 on average for just the insulin pump. When taking that into account, you also have to look at the type 2 diabetes, which may not be as much, but it's still almost $300 a month out of pocket just to get the medication you need to fix your insulin intake and receptors.
You're speaking about the costs, but what are some devices that are currently used or have previously been used to combat diabetes, and how does the area that people come from kind of affect their accessibility to these devices?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most prevalent of all these devices would be the insulin pump that we all know, but it actually started out as a big backpack that you would wear. And if this was around the 1970s, it was a big, backpack bulky device that really only tracked your base rate of insulin. But now today, almost 50 years later, we're at a point where it's almost the size of a cell phone, even can connect to some cell phones to monitor insulin levels and let the person with diabetes know when they have to take their next dose of insulin or anything like that. And that being type 1, type 2 is very similar. We have much new medication that can be taken as easy as a pill to fix your insulin receptors and insulin levels.
All right, thank you, Dr. Anthony Paptone, for just adding your insight on some of the devices that have to do with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm happy to share my research and insight with you all.
And now we have Shonik Karnik from the CDC, and he's going to help us discuss some future developments having to do with diabetes.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Shona Karnik from the CDC.
Thank you for coming. So before we get started, we've been asking everyone, what's your favorite Southern food?
So yeah, I'm actually from Georgia too, and every Thanksgiving my mom made pecan pie, and so I have really fond memories of that. So that definitely has to be my favorite.
Our previous guest, Anthony, talked a little bit about past developments within the development of medical devices to help deliver insulin. But can you give us some insight on future devices or anything currently out?
Yeah, so as Dr. Pepitone discussed, many medical devices have been invented to help treat diabetes, and with the constant development of technology, these devices and the way people interact with them have evolved over time. So the old technology of glass syringes and needles have evolved to smart insulin pens that can actually connect to your smartphone. These smart insulin pens can calculate insulin doses based on the user's current glucose level, size, and contents of their meal, and settings provided by their doctor. Additionally, it can help remind the user when to take a dose and when their insulin is expiring.
Those are very interesting. I know that the field of CS is rapidly changing and expanding. Do you think that there's anything that artificial intelligence or any of the new developing technology could be used within the medical field specifically in relation to diabetes?
Yeah, so looking into the future, researchers are implementing artificial intelligence and machine learning into diabetes technology. And actually, a recent study by Katarzyna Stawars and her colleagues analyzed how people currently interact with diabetes technology and how it can be improved. And they actually found that users are often overwhelmed with the data that is presented in the smartphone apps that's connected to diabetes technology, and they struggle to make decisions from the data. So they found that AI and machine learning can be actually implemented to improve decision making and to make predictions on blood glucose levels.
Okay, yeah, that's super interesting. Can you tell me a little more about these smartphone apps?
Yeah, so the apps that can connect to these smart insulin pens can actually track insulin and blood glucose data. One of the leading apps is called Dose Check, and this app can actually have a treatment plan loaded in by a doctor, and the app guides the user through the treatment process. And these technologies and softwares, such as this app, actually help people manage diabetes by making the treatment process more accessible and less overwhelming.
So within the South, there's a lot of Wi-Fi and cellular disparities. Do you think these apps will be harder to access and harder to use for patients with diabetes?
Yeah, I definitely think this will play a role into it because, as you said, people in rural communities have less access to internet connection, and people in poor areas have less access to technology in general. So these people will have less access to these apps and more advanced technology. So these disparities definitely have to be addressed before these solutions can be pushed out to people in rural communities.
Thank you, Shonik, for offering your insight on future developments of diabetic technology and how there are disparities in the South with this technology.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I know today we've made Southern food seem like honestly the worst thing to eat, but there are still ways to eat Southern or enjoy Southern cooking without it giving you diabetes.
I mean, everything's good in moderation, right?
Right, yeah. So again, like as I've said, like diabetes does not always just come from one genre of food. It's just, everyone has to watch their sugar intake, and Southern food happens to be a genre of food that happens to use a lot of sugar.
Even though there are a lot of negatives about diabetes, and I would never wish it on anyone, I'm glad that there are lots of treatment options and even more in the works.
Right, yeah, I'm so excited to see in the future what new apps or just technology that come about and how we can further expand this technology to rural areas. This is Emma,
And Layla,
and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Foods Across the U.S.
we want to say a big thank you to our sponsor and all of the guests who have come in and provided us insight. Tune in next week where we do a deep dive into New York pizza. Until then, bye.
Bye.